Isaiah Carter guided his sleek, near-silent electric car into the private Sterling skyport. The gentle hum of the vehicle merged with the faint rustle of the morning breeze. This wasn't an airport for the average traveler. It exuded exclusivity, the type of place reserved for those who had scaled the peaks of success. Isaiah had worked tirelessly to become one of those select few. Today was important. As the first rays of dawn kissed the polished exterior of his private jet, Isaiah couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and excitement. The aircraft stood proudly on the runway, an emblem of his journey, a marriage of cutting-edge efficiency and understated sophistication. The side of the fuselage bore his company's emblem, an elegant design symbolizing the aviation enterprise he had built with grit and determination. Isaiah stepped out of his car, his leather dress shoes clicking softly against the tarmac. He took a moment to savor the crisp air before adjusting his impeccably tailored charcoal suit. A quick glance at his timepiece, a minimalist watch more practical than ostentatious, confirmed he was right on schedule. Nearby, a group of ground crew members lingered, chatting casually until they noticed him. Their conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by sidelong glances and murmurs. Isaiah felt it immediately, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the air. Over the years, he had grown adept at recognizing such moments. The faint narrowing of eyes, the awkward pause in conversation, the almost imperceptible tightening of postures. It was a silent language he'd become fluent in, one that spoke volumes about doubt and bias. Despite his success, these microaggressions were a shadow that followed him everywhere, even in spaces where professionalism should have prevailed. Isaiah nodded courteously to the technicians as he approached his jet, wheeling his sleek leather briefcase behind him. They returned the gesture, but with a stiffness that betrayed their discomfort. He shrugged it off, turning his focus to the task ahead. Today's meeting was pivotal, a deal that could open doors to lucrative international markets. Isaiah's aviation company had seen a meteoric rise built on his resilience, sharp business instincts, and tireless innovation. But he was no stranger to the discomfort his achievements caused in certain circles. As he walked toward the jet, Isaiah mentally reviewed the flight plan. Flying wasn't just a means of travel for him. It was a passion he had cultivated long before launching his company. Earning his pilot's license had been a personal triumph, the result of years of dedication. Now, piloting his aircraft symbolized freedom and control, a reminder of how far he had come. Before climbing aboard, Isaiah paused and turned to take in the scene. The terminal, a sleek and modern building of glass and steel, reflected the softening hues of the dawn sky. A few early travelers moved through the space, but the employees near the entrance drew his attention. They were watching him, not with casual curiosity, but with an intensity that set him on edge. He sighed, trying to shake off the familiar weight of unease. Prejudice was no stranger to Isaiah, but it stung anew every time it reared its head. Success hadn't shielded him from it. If anything, it seemed to amplify the scrutiny he faced. The jet's glossy surface gleamed as he approached, the engines quietly humming in readiness. This aircraft wasn't just a tool for business, it was a testament to Isaiah's journey. He had broken barriers and defied expectations to get here. Still, even as he prepared to take off, he couldn't ignore the lingering tension in the air. Isaiah Carter watched as the ground crew moved with practiced efficiency around his jet, completing their final checks on the fuel and engine. Their motions, though routine, carried an air of hesitancy that Isaiah couldn't ignore. As he adjusted the documents in his hands, one of the crew, a stocky man with a furrowed brow, stepped forward, his gait uncertain. "Excuse me, sir," the man began, his voice neutral but tinged with something Isaiah couldn't quite pinpoint. "Are you the pilot of this aircraft?" The question caught Isaiah off guard. He had already provided every necessary document, from his flight plan to the jet's registration. There should have been no ambiguity about his role here. His brow furrowed slightly as he replied, keeping his tone steady. "Yes, I am. I'm both the owner and the pilot." For a moment, disbelief flashed across the man's face before he quickly masked it. "I see," he said. "Well, we just need to double-check a few things before you take off. Standard procedure." Isaiah nodded slowly, though he knew this was far from standard. He had gone through countless pre-flight processes before, and this level of scrutiny wasn't normal. However, he decided against arguing. Instead, he reached into his bag, retrieved his pilot's license and other documentation, and handed them over. The man took the papers, glancing over them briefly before heading toward the control tower. Isaiah watched him go, a familiar unease creeping into his chest. This wasn't the first time he had been subjected to extra verification, despite following protocol to the letter. No matter how much he achieved, it seemed some people were always looking for reasons to doubt him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. A reminder for his meeting flashed on the screen. A meeting that now felt frustratingly distant. He dismissed the notification and turned back to the task at hand. There was no use in dwelling on what he couldn't control. Isaiah continued his pre-flight inspection, walking around the jet to examine the wings, tires, and engine. The voices of the ground crew, now clustered in a corner, grew louder. Their eyes followed him, their whispered conversations underscoring the tension in the air. This wasn't new to Isaiah. No matter how high he climbed or how many milestones he reached, there were always those who saw him as an outsider. But he had learned long ago that the best response to such doubts was to keep moving forward, to let his success speak for itself. The technicians finally completed their checks, giving Isaiah a terse nod of approval. With a calm smile, he thanked them and climbed into the cockpit. As he settled into the pilot's seat, a sense of exhilaration began to replace the frustration. Flying was his escape, a chance to leave the noise and prejudices of the world behind. Isaiah ran through his mental checklist: fuel levels, engine performance, weather conditions. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. He was about to start the engines when movement at the edge of the runway caught his attention. 2 airport security officers stood just beyond the tarmac, their postures tense and rigid. One was speaking into a radio, while the other kept his eyes locked on Isaiah. Isaiah's stomach tightened. This was unusual. His unease deepened as, almost on cue, the piercing flash of red and blue lights filled the morning haze. A police car sped onto the runway, its sirens cutting through the quiet. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath to center himself. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly what this was about. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed out of the plane. As his polished shoes touched the tarmac, 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car. Both kept their hands alarmingly close to their holsters. One, a stocky man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, spoke first. "Sir, step away from the aircraft," he barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Isaiah raised his hands slightly, showing he posed no threat. Keeping his voice calm, he replied, "Good morning, officers. My name is Isaiah Carter. I'm the owner and pilot of this aircraft. Is there a problem?" The stocky officer squinted at him, ignoring the polite introduction. "We received a call about suspicious activity," he said curtly. "Can I see some identification?" Isaiah reached into his jacket, retrieving his wallet with measured movements. He handed over his pilot's license, flight certifications, and the jet's registration papers. The second officer, a younger man with an eager expression, snatched the documents and began flipping through them with little care. "This your plane?" he asked, the skepticism in his voice unmistakable. "Yes," Isaiah said evenly, suppressing the growing frustration inside him. "I've owned it for 3 years. My company operates multiple aircraft like this one." The younger officer smirked, muttering under his breath, "Must be nice." Isaiah clenched his jaw but refused to take the bait. He knew how quickly things could escalate. The officers exchanged a glance before the older one spoke into his radio. "Control, we're going to need a full ID check and verification on a private aircraft," he said, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. Isaiah exhaled slowly. A full ID check could mean hours of delays, maybe even more. But arguing would only make things worse. "Mind if we take a look inside the plane?" the older officer asked, though it was clear his request was anything but optional. "Yes, I do mind," Isaiah replied firmly. "This is private property. If you'd like to search it, I'll need to see a warrant." The officer's jaw tightened, his annoyance visible. "If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?" Isaiah met his gaze calmly. "The problem," he said, "is that I've provided all the necessary documentation. I've done everything by the book. If you don't believe me, that's your issue, not mine." The tension between them was palpable as Isaiah took a step back, his every move deliberate. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. Not today, not ever. A crowd was beginning to gather at the edge of the runway. Airport staff whispering amongst themselves, some pointing in Isaiah's direction. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to outright suspicion. None of them stepped forward to clarify the situation or vouch for Isaiah, despite his documented ownership of the jet. "Where are you headed, Mr. Carter?" the younger officer asked, his skepticism barely concealed. "New York," Isaiah replied patiently. "I have an important business meeting." The older officer nodded, as if mentally cataloging the information. "Why didn't you hire a pilot?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Isaiah gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am the pilot," he said simply. The officers exchanged another glance, this one heavier with doubt. The younger one chuckled under his breath, a short, derisive sound that made Isaiah's hands curl into fists at his sides. "Let me get this straight," the older officer said, crossing his arms. "You're telling me you're the owner and the pilot of this aircraft, and you just show up here. What, by yourself? No flight crew? No assistant?" "That's correct," Isaiah confirmed, his voice unwavering. "This isn't my first flight." The officer stared at him for a long moment, as if waiting for Isaiah to falter or contradict himself. When he remained calm and composed, the officer finally spoke into his radio. "Control, we're going to need a full ID check and verification on a private aircraft," he said, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. Isaiah felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew what a full ID check entailed. It wasn't just a background search. It was an interrogation, an invasive process that could delay him for hours, possibly even days. "You're not going anywhere until we've confirmed everything," the younger officer added with a smirk. "We have to make sure this isn't stolen property." Isaiah opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. He knew better than to escalate the situation. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and maintained a calm, impassive expression matching their detachment. "Mind if we take a look inside the plane?" the older officer asked casually, though the weight of his words made it clear this wasn't a request. "Yes, I do mind," Isaiah replied firmly. "This is private property, and I'd prefer you not search it without a warrant." The officer's jaw tightened, his irritation evident. "If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?" Isaiah met his gaze head-on. "The problem," he said evenly, "is that I've shown you my credentials, and I've done everything by the book. If you still don't believe me, that's your issue, not mine." The older officer's annoyance flickered across his face, but he said nothing. The younger one, however, continued to glare at Isaiah, clearly frustrated by his calm defiance. Isaiah could feel the tension mounting, but he stood his ground. He refused to let their doubts and assumptions shake him. This wasn't just about proving his ownership of the plane. It was about standing up for himself and refusing to be intimidated. Isaiah Carter stood silently as the officers exchanged a glance, the tension between them thick and oppressive. After a long pause, the older officer smirked, his expression one of faint condescension. "All right," he said, stepping back slightly, "but don't leave town just yet. We'll be back after we've run your name." Isaiah gave a curt nod, masking the frustration boiling inside him. He watched as the officers retreated to their patrol cars, one of them already speaking into the radio, while the other gestured animatedly toward a group of airport staff. The younger officer threw a sneering glance in Isaiah's direction before slamming the car door shut with unnecessary force. For a brief moment, Isaiah closed his eyes and drew in a deep, steadying breath. He needed to stay composed. Losing his temper now would only give them more ammunition to use against him. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a familiar number. Standing on the tarmac, his phone in hand, Isaiah took a moment to observe the scene. The flashing lights of the patrol cars reflected off the pristine surface of his jet, an unwelcome reminder of the indignity unfolding before him. He had faced situations like this before, instances where his success and identity were doubted, but this felt different. The hostility in the air was almost tangible, an oppressive force bearing down on him. The officers hadn't even offered him the courtesy of a seat inside the terminal while they conducted their so-called investigation. The humiliation of being left to stand on the runway stung, but Isaiah was determined not to let them see how deeply it affected him. He squared his shoulders, his every instinct warning him that the situation was about to escalate further. The ringing in his ear stopped, and a sharp, familiar voice came through the line. "Isaiah?" "Rebecca, it's me," Isaiah said, keeping his voice measured but firm. Rebecca Green, his lawyer, was known for her sharp mind and unyielding determination. If anyone could handle this, it was her. "What's going on?" Rebecca asked, her tone already serious. "I'm at Sterling Skyport, and we've got a problem," Isaiah began. "The police are here, holding me up for no reason. They're questioning my ownership of the jet, even though I've provided all the required documentation." There was a brief silence on the other end, and Isaiah could picture Rebecca narrowing her eyes in that calculating way she did when assessing a situation. "Have they searched the plane?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. "No," Isaiah replied. "I refused, but they've made it clear they don't believe me. They're running a full background check as we speak." "Good," Rebecca said briskly. "You did the right thing. They have no legal right to search without a warrant. I'm on my way. I'll be there as soon as possible." Isaiah exhaled softly, feeling a slight release of tension. "Thanks, Rebecca. Just hang tight," she said firmly. "Don't let them intimidate you. I'll take care of this." Isaiah ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, his mind racing with possible outcomes. Rebecca would handle the legal side, but in the meantime, he had to keep his cool. No matter how justified his anger might feel, letting it show would only make things worse. He glanced toward the patrol cars, where the officers were now speaking to a new arrival, a slightly older man, perhaps a higher-ranking officer. Their conversation was animated, with gestures and head-shaking that made it clear they were gearing up for something more serious. Isaiah's attention shifted as the younger officer from earlier broke away from the group and strode purposefully toward him. His posture was rigid, his expression smug. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, his voice laced with insincerity, "we're going to need you to step away from the aircraft completely. You're not allowed near it until we've finished our investigation." Isaiah narrowed his eyes slightly, his frustration evident in his tone. "And how long do you expect that to take? I have a business meeting to attend." The officer shrugged, clearly unmoved by Isaiah's urgency. "As long as it takes," he said flatly. "We have to make sure this plane isn't stolen." Isaiah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. "I've given you every document you asked for," he said, his voice steady but firm. "My pilot's license, the registration papers, everything is in order." The officer folded his arms, his smirk never reaching his eyes. "People forge documents all the time," he said casually. "Especially with high-end property like this. We just can't be too careful." Isaiah felt a surge of anger rise within him, but tamped it down. This wasn't about procedure. It was about prejudice. No matter how much evidence he provided, they had already decided not to trust him. "I understand you have a job to do," Isaiah said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "But I assure you, this plane is mine, and everything I've presented is legitimate." The officer didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on Isaiah as if searching for any sign of weakness. Isaiah stood his ground, his posture resolute. This was his property, his life's work, and no amount of skepticism or hostility would change that. The younger officer's smirk widened into something almost predatory. "Harassment?" he echoed mockingly. "We're just being thorough. You wouldn't want us to let a potential thief take off in a stolen jet, would you?" Isaiah held the officer's gaze, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. He recognized this tactic all too well. They were baiting him, hoping he'd snap and give them an excuse to escalate. He refused to play their game. Before he could respond, a group of airport security personnel approached, drawn to the unfolding drama. Leading them was a man in a crisp navy uniform with the Sterling Skyport insignia embroidered prominently on his chest. His tone was overly polite, though his eyes carried a hint of accusation as they landed on Isaiah. "What seems to be the issue here, officers?" the man asked. The younger officer straightened slightly, his smug expression unwavering. "We received a report about suspicious activity," he explained. "This gentleman claims he owns the jet, but we're just verifying the legitimacy of that claim." The airport official nodded slowly, his gaze remaining fixed on Isaiah. There was a flicker of doubt in his expression, as if the idea of Isaiah owning the plane didn't quite sit right with him. "I see," he said, his voice measured. "It's not common for someone to fly their private jet without a crew. You can understand why this raises concerns, Mr. Carter." Isaiah took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm despite the mounting pressure. "It's not unusual for someone who's both a licensed pilot and the owner of the aircraft," he said, his tone steady but firm. The official pursed his lips, clearly unconvinced. "Perhaps," he said after a pause. "But given the circumstances, I think it's best if we cooperate fully with the police until everything is sorted out." Isaiah felt his heart sink. It was evident now that no one in authority here was on his side. The airport staff had already drawn their conclusions, and the police were leveraging that bias to push their agenda. It didn't matter how many documents Isaiah presented or how calmly he explained himself. They had already decided he didn't belong. The older officer, who had been mostly silent, stepped forward then, his hand resting ominously close to his holster. His posture radiated authority as he addressed Isaiah. "Look," he said, his voice low and menacing, "we can make this easy, or we can make it hard. Step away from the plane, or we'll have to place you under arrest for obstruction." Isaiah felt the blood drain from his face. Arrest? For standing near his own property? The absurdity of the threat made his head spin. But the officer's expression left no doubt they were prepared to follow through. Raising his hands slightly in a gesture of compliance, Isaiah said calmly, "I'm stepping away. But for the record, I'm doing so under duress. This is my plane and I've done nothing wrong." The older officer gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement, but without a hint of remorse in his eyes. He was merely going through the motions, uninterested in truth or justice. Isaiah backed away from the jet, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of dozens of eyes bore down on him, officers, airport staff, and even a few passengers milling about in the distance, watching the spectacle unfold. He'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, despite being the rightful owner of everything in sight. As he stepped back, the younger officer advanced, his smirk firmly in place. "Turn around," he ordered, his tone dripping with mockery. "We're going to have to search you." Isaiah's eyes widened. "Search me? For what?" "Just standard procedure," the officer replied, his smile never wavering. "Unless you've got something to hide." Grinding his teeth, Isaiah turned slowly, his hands at his sides. He knew better than to resist. The officer's pat-down was unnecessarily rough, almost as if he was trying to provoke Isaiah into reacting. Isaiah kept his composure, refusing to give them what they wanted. When the search was over, the officer stepped back, his disappointment palpable. "You're clean," he said, sounding almost surprised. Isaiah turned to face him, locking eyes with the younger man. "I told you," he said quietly, "I have nothing to hide." The officer shrugged, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his movements now, as if realizing things weren't unfolding as he'd expected. "Doesn't mean you're free to go," the older officer interjected from behind him. "We're still waiting for verification." Isaiah stood his ground, his expression unreadable. Every instinct told him they weren't interested in finding the truth. They were looking for an excuse to keep him here. He wasn't going to give them one. Isaiah Carter stared down at the tarmac, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The suffocating sense of being trapped in a nightmare was all too familiar, a world where no amount of evidence could ever satisfy those determined to see him as less than he was. But he refused to let them break him. Not now, not ever. He stood motionless, the officer's words lingering in the air like a taunt. Every unnecessary pat-down, every smirk. It was all a calculated reminder of how little his success seemed to matter in moments like these. His every step had been deliberate, his documents impeccable, and yet here he was, treated like a criminal by the very system sworn to uphold the law. Isaiah glanced at his phone, checking the time. Each minute of delay brought him closer to jeopardizing the meeting that could define the future of his company. The weight in his chest wasn't fear, but exhaustion, the familiar ache of fighting the same battles in boardrooms, at checkpoints, and now, on the tarmac. He pulled out his phone and dialed Rebecca Green again. His lawyer and closest ally answered almost immediately, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Isaiah?" she said, her tone clipped with urgency. They're still holding me, Isaiah said quietly, keeping an eye on the officers nearby. They've searched me, called for backup, and now they're talking about detaining me until they verify everything. Rebecca's tone darkened. This is absolutely unacceptable. Do not say another word to them. I'll handle it as soon as I get there. Isaiah could hear the fire in her voice, the no-nonsense determination that had earned her a reputation as one of the sharpest legal minds in the city. Her confidence gave him a flicker of reassurance, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. I'll stay quiet, Isaiah promised. But they're escalating. They've already floated the idea of arresting me for obstruction. Rebecca's quiet curse on the other end of the line was laced with fury. They're playing a dangerous game, she said tightly. Sit tight. I'll be there in a few minutes. Don't give them anything they can use against you. Isaiah ended the call, sliding his phone back into his pocket just as the older officer approached him again. His expression was stern, but there was a hint of smugness in his posture, as though he believed the battle had already been won. Mr. Carter, the officer began, his tone artificially polite, we're still waiting on verification for your documents. In the meantime, you need to remain where you are. If you try to leave, we'll have no choice but to detain you. Isaiah gave a slow nod, his face unreadable. Understood, he replied evenly, but my lawyer will be here shortly, Winnie. I trust that won't be an issue. The officer's composure faltered for a split second, just long enough for Isaiah to notice. But the smirk returned quickly, albeit weaker this time. Of course, the officer said, though the words lacked conviction. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Isaiah held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let moments like this shake him. He turned his gaze toward the terminal, where a small crowd of employees continued to gather, whispering amongst themselves. Their murmurs were like a distant hum in Isaiah's ears, irrelevant background noise to the conflict playing out in front of him. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Isaiah stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his mind racing through every possible outcome. The officers lingered nearby, exchanging whispers and glances, their frustration evident. It was clear they were hoping he'd slip up, give them a reason to escalate further. But Isaiah knew this script. He'd been through it before. Different faces, different locations, but always the same story. The sound of an approaching engine broke the tense silence. Isaiah turned toward the source and felt a wave of relief as Rebecca's sleek black sedan came into view, pulling up to the edge of the runway. She stepped out with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase, Rebecca radiated confidence and authority. Her presence was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around Isaiah. She wasted no time. Who's in charge here? Rebecca demanded, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. The older officer stepped forward, his gruff demeanor undeterred by her abrupt entrance. That would be me, he said. And you are? Rebecca Green, she replied, flashing her credentials with a practiced flick of her wrist. I'm Mr. Carter's legal counsel. I need to know exactly what's going on here. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly unimpressed by her presence. We're conducting an investigation, he said flatly. Mr. Carter's claim of ownership is under review. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her expression icy. Under review by whom? He's provided all the necessary documentation. You have no legal grounds to detain him. The younger officer stepped forward, emboldened by his colleague's presence. We're just being cautious, he said with a smug grin. You can't trust everything at face value these days. Rebecca turned her steely gaze on him, her voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. What I know, she said slowly, is that you're treading dangerously close to unlawful detention. My client has done nothing wrong, and every second you continue this baseless charade is opening you up to serious legal consequences. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words clearly sinking in. We're just following protocol, he muttered, but the confidence in his tone had waned. Rebecca took a step closer, her gaze unrelenting. Then you'd better hope your protocol includes a section on illegal detention, she said sharply. Release my client immediately, or you'll be hearing from a judge. Isaiah watched the exchange, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. For the first time all morning, the balance of power was shifting in his favor. Rebecca stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his. "Then you'd better hope your protocol includes a section on unlawful detention," she said firmly. "Because that's exactly what you're doing. Release him now, or I'll have a judge on the phone within the hour." The officer opened his mouth to argue, but Rebecca raised a hand to silence him. "You have no case," she said flatly, "and the longer you continue this nonsense, the worse it's going to look for you." A tense silence fell over the group. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of Rebecca's words clearly sinking in. Isaiah watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Rebecca was relentless, and they knew it. There was no easy way out for them now. After what felt like an eternity, the older officer gave a reluctant nod. "Fine," he muttered. "He's free to go, but we'll be keeping an eye on this situation." Rebecca gave him a thin, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You do that," she said coolly, "and we'll be keeping an eye on you." She turned to Isaiah, her expression softening slightly. "Let's go," she said quietly. Isaiah nodded, grateful for her presence but still simmering with anger. As they walked back toward the jet, he couldn't resist glancing over his shoulder at the officers. They were huddled together, muttering under their breath. The airport employees, sensing the drama was over, began to disperse. Isaiah knew better than to think this was truly over. Not by a long shot. He was determined to ensure those responsible would face the consequences of their actions. As he climbed back into the cockpit, Rebecca stood at the base of the steps, her expression resolute. "I'll make some calls," she said. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Isaiah managed a tight smile. "Thank you, Rebecca." She reached out and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Take care of yourself, Isaiah. Don't let them get to you." He nodded, his expression unreadable, as he closed the cockpit door and began preparing for takeoff. Inside, his resolve burned brighter than ever. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. Isaiah sat in the cockpit, his hands resting on the controls, his mind racing with the events of the last hour. The tension inside him hadn't fully dissipated despite Rebecca's firm intervention. While his legal defense was in place, the sting of how quickly things had spiraled into hostility lingered like a heavy weight on his chest. He had spent years meticulously building his reputation, ensuring that no detail of his business or personal life could be questioned. And yet, here he was again, forced to defend not just his assets, but his very identity. Just as he was about to power up the plane's systems, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his business partner, Mark Delaney. "On our way. Hang tight." Isaiah exhaled sharply. Of all the mornings for things to go sideways, it had to be this one, the day he was supposed to finalize a deal that would mark a turning point for his company. The merger with Mark's firm was critical. If this meeting were delayed too long, the ripple effects could be devastating, potentially costing him millions. A knock at the cockpit door startled him. Isaiah turned to see Rebecca standing outside, her expression as sharp as ever. "We're not done yet," she said through the slightly open door. "Your business partners just arrived. I've asked them to join us." Isaiah nodded, opening the door fully and stepping down onto the tarmac. In the distance, two figures were approaching. Mark Delaney and another partner, Nina Harris, were sharply dressed, their expressions a mix of concern and impatience. Behind them, an airport official trailed nervously, clearly flustered by the unfolding events. Isaiah straightened his shoulders, preparing himself for the next chapter of the morning's ordeal. If the authorities and onlookers thought they had seen the last of him, they were sorely mistaken. As Mark Delaney and Nina Harris approached the jet, Isaiah Carter forced a polite smile. Though frustration still simmered beneath his calm exterior, he gestured toward the patrol cars parked conspicuously at the edge of the runway. "Mark, Nina, I'm sorry you had to walk into this mess," Isaiah said, his tone apologetic. "It's been an ordeal." Mark, tall and broad-shouldered, shook Isaiah's hand firmly, his brow furrowed in concern. "Ordeal is putting it lightly," he replied. "We came as soon as we heard. What on earth is going on here?" Before Isaiah could answer, Nina interjected. Her sharp eyes darted toward the officers, who were still watching the scene unfold from a distance. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice brimming with indignation. "We've been business partners for years, and they're treating you like a criminal." What's the current status? Rebecca Green stepped forward, her professional demeanor unshaken. We've made progress, she said crisply. The officers have been forced to stand down, and Isaiah is free to leave. However, this is far from over. I'm recommending we move forward with a formal complaint. This is a clear case of racial profiling and unlawful detention. Mark's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the officers. Good, he said, his tone sharp. They need to be held accountable. What they've done isn't just unprofessional, it's disgraceful. Nina nodded in agreement. I'll make sure our PR team is ready to handle any fallout, she added. This kind of story is going to attract attention whether we want it to or not. Isaiah appreciated their support but was acutely aware of the delicate balance he had to maintain. On one hand, his partners were right, this needed to be addressed publicly. On the other hand, the merger was still in progress, and too much negative attention could jeopardize the deal. We'll address it, Isaiah said, his voice calm but resolute. But for now, we need to focus on the business at hand. The deal remains the priority. Rebecca gave a slight nod. Understood. I'll manage the legal side, and we can control the public response until the time is right. As they spoke, an airport official who had followed Mark and Nina finally stepped forward. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and he looked visibly uneasy. Mr. Carter, the man began, his voice tight with nerves. On behalf of Westbridge Airfield, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding. We had no idea. Of course you didn't, Nina cut in, her tone icy. But you should have. How could something like this even happen? The official stammered, his wide eyes darting nervously between the group. It was an honest mistake, I assure you. We simply had to verify. Verify what? Mark interrupted, his voice rising with anger. That a black man can own a jet? That he can pilot his own aircraft? This wasn't about verification. It was about prejudice. The official flinched at Mark's sharp words, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of the group. I assure you, there was no ill intent, he stuttered. We take our security protocols very seriously, and sometimes these things happen. These things happen? Rebecca repeated, her voice razor sharp. Do you realize how absurd that sounds? That's not an excuse, it's an admission of failure. The official's face reddened further, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of their collective gaze. I'll make sure this never happens again, he mumbled, stepping back slightly. Isaiah watched the interaction unfold with a sense of detachment. This man wasn't the enemy, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. The real issue lay within the system itself, which made it so easy for people like Isaiah to be doubted, questioned, and marginalized, no matter how successful or accomplished they were. We're not looking for empty promises, Isaiah said, his voice calm but authoritative. We're looking for change. This can't happen again, not to me, not to anyone. The official nodded rapidly, eager to end the conversation. Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll ensure changes are made immediately. Please accept our sincerest apologies. Isaiah gave a curt nod. Thank you. With that, the official scurried away, leaving Isaiah and his team standing by the jet. Across the runway, the officers still lingered near their patrol car. Though they made no further attempts to approach, their frustration and unease were evident. Isaiah felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They had tried to undermine him, and they had failed. Now, they were the ones left feeling powerless. Mark turned to Isaiah, his expression softening slightly. You handled that well, he said, but you shouldn't have to deal with this at all. Isaiah sighed, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him. It's part of the reality I live with, he said quietly, but I'm not going to let it stop me. Rebecca gave Isaiah a reassuring nod. We'll take it from here, she said. The legal side is under control, and I'll make sure this is addressed properly. Isaiah managed a small smile. Thank you, Rebecca. She gave his shoulder a brief squeeze before stepping back. Take care of yourself, Isaiah, and don't let them get to you. Isaiah Carter drew in a deep breath, steeling himself. We've got work to do, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Nina Harris placed a hand on his arm, her tone steady but supportive. We're with you, Isaiah, whatever you need. Isaiah nodded, deeply appreciative of their solidarity. Let's focus, he said. We've wasted enough time, this deal needs to happen. Rebecca Green, never one to miss a beat, stepped forward, her phone already in hand. "I'm making a few calls," she said briskly. "I'll ensure the legal side is airtight. You'll hear from me about any updates. For now, focus on your meeting." Isaiah watched as Rebecca strode toward her car, already engrossed in a conversation with someone on the other end of the line. He knew she would handle the legal aftermath flawlessly, but the emotional weight of the morning lingered. Success had taught Isaiah many lessons, but one of the harshest truths was that it didn't shield him from prejudice. It only made the target on his back more conspicuous. Despite the support of his team, the morning's events weighed heavily on him. As Isaiah turned toward the jet, Mark Delaney and Nina followed closely behind. Their presence was a reminder that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. They were partners in business, and when necessary, allies in navigating the challenges that came with his success. Together, the three of them climbed aboard the jet, ready to leave the chaos behind. Isaiah settled into the pilot seat, exhaling slowly as he adjusted the controls. Yet, even as the engines roared to life and the aircraft began to roll down the runway, the tension in his chest didn't fully dissipate. Mark and Nina sat quietly in the cabin, giving Isaiah the space he needed. As the plane lifted into the sky, Isaiah watched Westbridge Airfield shrink below him. The weight of the morning's ordeal began to lift, but it didn't disappear. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. This is far from over. Isaiah was determined to ensure accountability. Everyone responsible for what happened would face the consequences, and changes would be made to prevent others from experiencing the same treatment. The steady hum of the jet provided a backdrop for Isaiah's thoughts as he reflected on the events of the day. His mind wandered to the countless others who had faced similar discrimination but lacked the resources, legal support, or influence to fight back. This incident wasn't just about him. It was a reflection of a much larger systemic issue. The flight gave him a rare moment of clarity. He thought about the people denied opportunities, harassed, or dismissed simply because of the color of their skin. This fight wasn't just personal. It was about setting a precedent and paving the way for change. When the jet landed in New York, Rebecca was already waiting for them at the edge of the tarmac. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her expression a mixture of focus and frustration. As soon as Isaiah stepped off the plane, Rebecca ended her call and strode toward him, skipping any pleasantries. "They're trying to bury this," she said bluntly. "The police department and airport administration are scrambling to cover their tracks. They're framing this as a misunderstanding, hoping it will blow over." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "They can't be allowed to walk away from this," he said firmly. "Not this time." Rebecca nodded, her resolve matching his. "I've already filed a formal complaint," she said. "The officers involved are facing an internal investigation, and I've alerted the media. This story is going public. They don't get to pretend it didn't happen." Mark and Nina joined them, both nodding in agreement. "We'll make sure our PR team is ready to handle the fallout," Nina said confidently. "This isn't just about protecting your reputation, Isaiah. It's about making a statement." Isaiah appreciated their support, but knew this was only the beginning. "What about the airport?" he asked Rebecca. "What consequences are they facing?" Rebecca's tone was sharp. "The administration is scrambling to save face. They've issued a formal apology, but that's not nearly enough. I'm pushing for systemic changes. Mandatory anti-discrimination training, new protocols for handling private aircraft, and public accountability." Isaiah's expression hardened, his determination evident. "Good," he said, "but I want those officers held accountable. They didn't just make a mistake, they acted on prejudice. They need to answer for that." Rebecca's expression darkened. "They will," she promised. "We're filing a civil rights lawsuit against both the police department and the airport. This isn't just about compensation, it's about ensuring this never happens again." Isaiah nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Make it happen." Rebecca gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder before turning back to her phone, already dialing another number to push the process forward. Mark and Nina stayed close, their presence a silent but powerful reminder that Isaiah wasn't in this fight alone. In the days that followed the incident at Westbridge Airfield, the story gained unstoppable momentum. Social media platforms erupted with discussions about racial profiling, systemic racism, and the urgent need for reform in law enforcement practices. People from all walks of life called for accountability, sharing their outrage and demanding justice. The pressure on authorities was immense. The police department was forced to issue a public statement acknowledging an internal investigation into the actions of the officers involved. Meanwhile, the airport administration scrambled to recover, announcing new protocols and mandatory diversity training for all staff. It was a step forward, but Isaiah Carter knew it was just the beginning. The officers who had harassed him were placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. While it wasn't the full justice Isaiah sought, it was a start. With Rebecca Green leading the charge, he was confident the fight would see its rightful conclusion. Despite the turmoil, Isaiah's professional endeavors pressed on. The merger with Mark Delaney's company moved forward without a hitch. The ordeal, though exhausting, had only strengthened their resolve to succeed, proving that no amount of prejudice could derail their plans. One sunny afternoon, Isaiah sat in his office, the city skyline stretching before him through the wide glass windows. His phone buzzed, and Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. "We've made progress," Rebecca said as soon as he answered. Her tone carried the confidence Isaiah had come to rely on. "The officers are facing disciplinary action, and the airport has agreed to implement the systemic changes we demanded. We've also secured a settlement. But more importantly, we've set a precedent. This case will make them think twice before acting on their biases again." Isaiah leaned back in his chair, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. This wasn't just a legal win. It was a powerful statement. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said quietly, the gratitude evident in his voice. Rebecca's tone softened. "This is just the beginning, Isaiah. We're not done yet, but at least we've taken the first step." After the call ended, Isaiah sat in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought of his younger self, a man who had faced rejection after rejection, told time and again that he didn't belong in certain spaces. And now, here he was, proving them all wrong. But this victory wasn't just about his success. It was about his unyielding determination to drive change. Isaiah turned to the skyline, his mind already on the challenges ahead. There would be more battles to fight, more walls to break down. But he was ready. The morning sun poured into Isaiah's office as he prepared for the day. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of lawsuits, media coverage, public apologies, and institutional policy changes. But now, as he reviewed the final documents for the merger, a sense of calm settled over him. This battle wasn't just for his reputation. It was for the countless others who faced similar struggles but didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the city below. It was remarkable how quickly life could change. One moment, he was preparing for a routine business trip. The next, he was embroiled in a legal and public relations storm. And yet, as he looked back, he saw the importance of what had transpired. The ordeal had exposed a system that thrived on prejudice. And though the battle wasn't over, Isaiah had managed to crack that wall. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mark Delaney and Nina Harris stepped in, their energy lifting the room's atmosphere. The weight of the past weeks began to ease as they refocused on the future. "All set for the final meeting?" Mark asked, dropping into a chair opposite Isaiah. Isaiah nodded, glancing at the merger documents in front of him. "Everything's in order," he said. "This deal will solidify our company's expansion into the international market." Nina smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You've come such a long way, Isaiah. This merger is going to take us to the next level. I can't wait to see where we'll be a year from now." Isaiah smiled back, though his thoughts lingered on the journey that had brought him here. The chaos following the airport incident had been overwhelming. Media interviews, meetings with Rebecca, and endless updates on the legal process. The airport administration's public apology had been swift, followed by the police department's reluctant acknowledgement of the misconduct. Changes were promised. Mandatory training, new protocols for handling private flights. And while it was a step in the right direction, Isaiah knew there was more to be done. With Rebecca's relentless pursuit of justice, the officers involved faced suspension and internal investigations. Talks of broader reforms within the department were beginning to take shape. Change would be slow, But the impact of Isaiah's case was undeniable. The settlement they had secured was substantial, but money had never been the point. What mattered most was exposing the flawed system and ensuring tangible consequences for those who acted on prejudice. As the three partners prepared for their meeting, Isaiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This merger wasn't just about business success. It was about proving that no amount of discrimination could hold him back. And while the fight for equality was far from over, Isaiah knew he had already made a significant dent in the walls that had once stood in his way. The future was bright, and he was ready to face it head-on. Isaiah's lawyer, Rebecca Green, had been tireless in her pursuit of justice. Her efforts had led to the suspension of the officers involved, who were now facing internal investigations. Talks of broader departmental reforms were also underway. While Isaiah knew meaningful change would take time, he found solace in the fact that his case had sparked progress. The settlement they had secured, though significant, wasn't the real victory. For Isaiah, the importance lay in exposing a flawed system and driving tangible consequences. This win wasn't just for him. It was for anyone who had ever been doubted, marginalized, or denied opportunities because of their race. As Isaiah sat in the conference room with Mark Delaney and Nina Harris, a quiet reflection settled over the group. Isaiah broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "And I keep coming back to the same thought. This fight isn't just about what happened to me. It's about changing the system so others don't have to go through the same thing." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "It's more than just a personal battle, that's for sure," he said. Nina leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're right, Isaiah. We can't let this momentum fade. You've got a platform now, not just as a successful businessman, but as someone who can drive real change." Isaiah smiled at the thought, but it wasn't just a smile of satisfaction. It was a smile of determination. "I'm planning to do exactly that," he said. "This company has grown beyond what I ever imagined, but there's more we can do. I want us to invest in communities and create opportunities for people who've been held back by the same prejudices I've faced." Mark grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Now that's something I can get behind, a business that gives back and creates lasting change." Nina raised an eyebrow. "So, what's the plan? A new initiative? A foundation?" Isaiah nodded, his mind already buzzing with possibilities. "I want to start a foundation focused on education, mentorship, and legal support for people impacted by racial profiling and discrimination. It's not just about fighting legal battles, it's about giving people the tools they need to succeed." The room fell quiet as the gravity of Isaiah's vision settled in. This wasn't just an idea. It was a bold step toward reshaping lives and breaking down barriers that had existed for far too long. "That's incredible," Nina said, her voice full of admiration. "You're turning this whole situation into something positive, something that can help so many people." Isaiah felt a swell of pride, but it wasn't just about his success anymore. It was about the future, about using the platform he had built to uplift others. "I've been lucky," he said quietly. "I've had the resources and the support to fight back, but not everyone does. That's what needs to change." Mark and Nina exchanged glances, both of them nodding in agreement. "We're with you," Mark said firmly. "Whatever you need to get this off the ground, we'll make it happen." As the meeting continued, Isaiah felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. The challenges he had faced had brought him to this moment, a crossroads where he could turn adversity into opportunity. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a profound sense of clarity. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about building a legacy of change, one that would empower others and dismantle the barriers that had stood in their way for far too long. Isaiah Carter wasn't just flying to new heights in his business. He was charting a course for a better future, and nothing could stop him now.